I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. Financier and businessman John B. Carrie built a dazzling 5-story brick hotel in the second half of 1886 to the tune of 100,000 historical dollars, or the equivalent of $2.9 million in today's money. This marvel of late 19th century eclectic architecture, yes, that's a real thing, was built on the corner of Douglas and St. Francis Streets and was dedicated in 1887. But not only was this place a unique, inspiring location to stay when vacationing in Wichita, Kansas, it also held one of the most elegant bars in the Midwest. It was known as the Show Saloon of Wichita, and it featured a large nude painting titled Cleopatra at the Bath by the noted Wichita artist John Noble, and it was worth a reported $8,700 in modern money. And on the morning of December 27, 1900, an unusually tall woman with extreme Victorian values, with a significant hatchet to grind, rolled into Wichita, Kansas with her eyes on that naked lady and the bar in front of her. That woman was Carrie Nation. Carrie A. Nation. Today's margarita is in honor of a woman who would not let her lips touch the sinner's nectar. So we're deconstructing it. First, we're making a traditional margarita with the alcohol omitted. So you'll need 1 part lime juice, 1 part triple sec, and 1 part simple syrup. We will shake this up and strain it over fresh ice. Then, to the side of this, put a shot glass with a shot of tequila in it and add a lime. You decide what parts of the deconstructed margarita you'll enjoy. Carrie would suggest the one without the booze. I would suggest both. Caroline Amelia Moore was born on November 25, 1846, in Garrett County, Kentucky, to her father, George Moore, and mother, Mary Moore. I must interrupt here to say that I was Google searching how to pronounce the county name where Carrie was born, and there is the most adorable YouTube video of basically everyone in the entire county telling us how to pronounce the name. So for once, I can guarantee I'm getting it right. Thanks, Garrett County. Anyway, Carrie's father was a successful farmer by trade, but was also a successful stock trader and predictably a slaveholder. George, and thereby Carrie, was of Irish descent. Her mother worked inside the home. She also had a younger brother named Charles. Despite her father's career success, the family faced a series of financial setbacks, leading them to move frequently both in and out of the state during Carrie's early childhood, until they settled in Belton, Missouri in 1854, when Carrie was around 8 years old. During much of her early life, Carrie suffered ill physical health. Also important to note, mental illness ran rampant in Carrie's family, stemming at least most prominently and obviously on her mother's side. It is well documented that Mary, Carrie's mother, suffered with frequent and public delusions. It is even speculated that the reason the family moved so often in Carrie's early years was because of the rumor mills about Mary that spun everywhere they moved. There is also documentation of her maternal uncle's loud and public delusions as well. If you want to learn more about her mother and uncle and specifics, I think it's most appropriate for you to do that research on your own. I listened to a few other podcasts, which I won't name, that really made fun of Carrie's mother and her suffering. And admittedly, that suffering did manifest itself into some pretty amusing things. But listening to them laugh about it really it didn't sit well with me. Treatment for mental illness in the late 19th century was stodgy at best. I don't think it's fair to make judgments, much less poke fun of someone who didn't even have access to make things better for themselves. And though it sounds like it's likely that these things were true about Mary, it's well known that it didn't take much for someone to be institutionalized in the late 19th century, especially if you were a woman in America. In fact, between the years of 1850 and 1900, women were literally locked away in mental institutions for behaving in ways that male society did not agree with. Many, many women were locked away for being independent, assertive, or even ambitious. You didn't have to be delusional to get locked into an institution. You just had to have a mind of your own. So maybe Carrie's mother was insane, or maybe her son owed her money and therefore instigated a lawsuit. But either way, that legal action caused her to be institutionalized in an asylum in Nevada, Missouri from August 1890 until her death on September 28, 1893, when Carrie was 47 years old. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. After Missouri's increasing involvement in the Civil War in 1862, the Moore family continued to face similar economic difficulties, so they moved to High Grove Farm in Cass County, Missouri, shortly after. After the arrival of the Union Army, they were evacuated from their farm to Kansas City. Young 16-year-old Carrie nursed wounded soldiers in Independence, Missouri around that time. After the end of the Civil War in 1865, the Moore family returned to their farm. It was around this time Carrie met a young doctor and Union soldier named Charles Gloyd. He had been teaching school near the Moore farm while deciding where to start his own medical practice after the Civil War, and he may have even been a boarder at the Moore farm. Carrie's parents had a lot of misgivings about Charles. For one, he was 27 years old and Carrie was only 19. But even more concerning, Charles was a drinker. Much like many other soldiers during the Civil War, he had picked up the habit while waiting around in camp for the next battle. Mary and George would not allow Carrie and Charles to be alone together for any reason, but that didn't stop them from writing to one another. In a letter he wrote to her on June 2, 1867, he said, among a lot of other flowery requests for marriage, quote, "I tell you, Carrie, love, the time will come that your parents will see they are wrong. God is my support and my strength, and I will prove that to them." End quote. He did not convince her parents of that thing at all, but it didn't matter much. Carrie was in love. They were married on November 21st, 1867, but the drinking worsened. He spent many evenings drinking with his fellow Masons, and despite her requests for them to help him control it, they did nothing. Because of this, Carrie would carry, get it? A disdain for the Masons for the rest of her life. Carrie became pregnant, and because of the drinking, separated from Charles and moved back to her parents' farm. Charles wrote to Carrie, saying, quote, "Pet, if you leave me, I will be a dead man in 6 months." End quote. In less than 2 years after their marriage, he was right. He had drank himself to death, leaving behind a 23-year-old widow and their 6-month-old daughter, Charlene Clara Annie Lloyd, who had been born on November 21st, 1867. Carrie was left as the sole support for her daughter and her mother-in-law, whom was called Mother Gloyd. She took her portion of her husband's estate and sold the land she inherited after his death and built a small house in Holden, Missouri. She started teaching after gaining a certificate in July 1872 from the Warrensburg Normal Institute in Missouri. She taught for 4 years and also earned a history degree, studying the influence of Greek philosophers on American politics. After she was forced out of her teaching job for, get this, mispronouncing words, she prayed and prayed for a second man to come into her life and support her, Charlene, and Mother Gloyd. As if to answer her prayers, David A. Nation, a minister, newspaper journalist, and lawyer, came into her life. Despite being 19 years her senior, love blossomed and they married in 1874. They purchased a large cotton plantation in Brazoria County, Texas, along the San Bernard River. The farming venture pretty quickly failed, as you can probably see that neither one of these two were much of a farmer. David moved into a town in Brazoria to practice law, and in about 1880, Carrie and Charlene moved to Columbia, Texas, about 15 miles from Brazoria, to act as a hotel operator. Carrie was a devout Christian and attended Columbia Methodist Church during this time. She lived at the hotel with Charlene, Mother Gloyd, and David's daughter from a previous marriage, Lola. Charlene, like her mother, had frequent illnesses in childhood. Carrie, a robust writer and diary keeper, wrote often about her daughter, but instead of recognizing how her own genes may have impacted her daughter's health, blamed Charles's alcoholism for her daughter's ailments. She would write in her 1908 autobiography, quote, "This, my only child, was peculiar. She was the result of a drunken father and a distracted mother. The curse of heredity is one of the most heartbreaking results of the saloon. Poor little children are brought into the world with the curse of drink and disease entailed upon them. The ignorance of the mothers and the ignorance and vice of the fathers is given to the children before they are born, and these feeble and deformed minds and bodies with the depraved appetites threatens to deteriorate the human family, and we will be a race of idiots and insane people if something isn't done." End quote. All right, Carrie, tell me how you really feel. Carrie and David did what they could to improve Charlene's health, taking her to doctors as far away as New York City. The family briefly moved to Richmond, Texas to operate a hotel, but in 1889, the family moved to Medicine Lodge, Kansas, where David found more success at preaching than he did at farming or lawyering. Carrie, on the other hand, didn't always approve of David's preaching and often corrected him loudly while he was on the pulpit. Carrie ran another hotel very successfully in Medicine Lodge during this time. She became a well-known and beloved member of the community. The town soon called her Mother Nation for her generosity and kindness. Among other things, she founded a sewing circle to make clothing for the poor, as well as prepare meals for them on holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas. But, as one of her contemporaries said about Carrie, quote, "Whatever she believes in with her whole soul, and nothing except superior force can stay her." End quote. Fueled by her continued rage over the loss of her first husband to the sin sauce, Carrie founded a local branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and began her campaign, soon to be crusade, for the enforcement of Kansas's liquor laws. You see, there was already a ban on the sale of liquor in Kansas at this time. In 1880, Kansas voters had approved an amendment to the Kansas Constitution prohibiting all manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors. In fact, Kansas was the first state in the United States to enact a statewide constitutional prohibition on liquor, and they actually continued to prohibit alcohol until 1948. But there's a difference between laws and enforcement of laws. In Topeka, the capital city of Kansas alone, there were 43 liquor joints still in operation, including one called the Senate Saloon, a frequent hangout spot of the state legislature. Carrie and other members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union managed to get 7 illegal joints closed, non-violently. But things began to escalate with Carrie. What started as protests turned next into serenading saloon patrons with hymns, then to heading to the bar and greeting the bartender by saying, quote, "Good morning, destroyer of men's souls," end quote. Evidently, the 7 saloons did not satisfy Carrie, and through her verdant prayer, she believed she'd been given her next directive through a holy vision. She would later write, quote, "The next morning I was awakened by a voice which seemed to me speaking in my heart these words, 'Go to Kiowa.' And my hands were lifted and thrown down, and the words, 'I'll stand by you.' I was impressed with a great inspiration. The interpretation was very plain. It was this: take something in your hands and throw at these places in Kiowa and smash them." End quote. For those of you not familiar with Kansas geography, Kiowa is a neighboring town to Medicine Lodge, about 24 miles away. It had a population at the time of about 800 people and over a dozen saloons. On the morning of June 7th, 1900, Carrie made her family breakfast, saw her husband off to work with a kiss, and then filled the back of her wagon with smashers, rocks and brickbats. Her target was Jasper Dobson's Speakeasy, and as she entered, in an outfit that could have easily been worn by a church deaconess, she announced, quote, "Men, I have come to save you from a drunkard's fate," end quote. She hurled her smashers at bottles, glassware, and furnishings. That same day, she wrecked 2 more joints. As a result, officials shut down the rest of the dozen saloons, thereby declaring a Carrie Nation victory. Thus began a decades-long crusade to destroy the devil's nectar. Throughout Kansas, Carrie continued her rampage, earning herself the nickname of Cyclone Carrie. She refined her tools of destruction. 2 days after Christmas, on an 86-mile trip to the big city of Wichita to destroy that naked lady painting, she added an iron rod to her tool belt. Following that incident, David joked that she should use a hatchet next time. Carrie took his advice, and a month later in the capital city, she added the tool that would become her trademark, the hatchet. Upon her arrival by train, there was a large gathering of curiosity seekers waiting for her. They led her to several saloons ready to see her do her work. Surprising everyone, she used her time in Topeka first to simply plead with the owners, many of whom were scared of her arrival and tried to barricade the doors to prevent her entrance, to voluntarily close down. In Topeka, she had a larger mission. She wanted the governor to actually enforce the laws on the book. She met with William Stanley, governor at the time, but he was disinterested in providing her with any assurances. So she and a group of supporters marched towards the bars. When a week later they hadn't voluntarily closed down, as she'd asked, she headed straight to that famous Senate saloon. They destroyed slot machines, a cash register, and many of the bar's fixtures. This time she was arrested. After her release 2 weeks later, she and her followers attacked an additional 7 bars in Topeka. Carrie and her followers smashed saloons all over Kansas from 1900 to early 1901. They would march into a bar and sing and pray while smashing bar fixtures and any alcohol barrels and bottles they could find. Carrie, always wielding a hatchet. Hatchetations, as she called them, got her thrown in jail at least 30 times, but that's far less than the number of saloons she destroyed. It's a little challenging to arrest someone for destroying something that's illegal and not even supposed to be there in the first place. Saloons across the country were made to be on the lookout for Carrie and her hatchetations, and many of them made signs hung above the bar that said, "All nations welcome, but Carrie." On September 14, 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated, and Carrie, believing that the president was a closet drinker, declared, "Drinkers got what they deserved." But Carrie didn't just smash and insult the dead. In 1901, she founded a shelter described as an early model for battered women's shelters for wives and children of alcoholics in Kansas City, Missouri. She traveled all over the country, advocating for prohibition as well as the women's right to vote. She once told the Kansas House of Representatives, quote, "You refused me the vote, and I had to use a rock," end quote. Indeed, women's suffrage and prohibition in many ways go hand in hand. Carrie wasn't the only woman in the United States disenchanted with alcohol. Many women's husbands drank away money for bills, stayed out all night at the saloons and couldn't go to work in the morning, and were verbally and physically abusive towards their families once they had something to drink. The alcohol of the time was much stronger than what most people drink today. And for women across the country, it became clear that the only way to ban alcohol once and for all was, according to noted suffragist Susan B. Anthony, to, quote, "put the ballot into the hands of women," end quote. Carrie paid for all of her court fees, bail, and travel through lecture tour fees, and she also sold small lapel stick pins in the shape of hatchets that were made by a pharmacist in Topeka. Engraved on the handle of some of the hatchets were her name, Carrie A. Nation, but with the purposeful misspelling of her first name to Carry, Carrie A. Nation. In fact, in 1903, she officially changed the spelling of her name. The cardstock that the pin was attached to when you purchased it had the words Home Defender typed on it. Another one of the pin designs had Death to Rum engraved on the handle. Carrie led women's rights marches all over the country. She published a newsletter advocating for her beliefs called the Smasher's Mail, and also published a newspaper called The Hatchet. She effectively retired from smashing in 1901 and made Topeka her home until 1905. She and David had actually divorced in 1901. In 1905, Carrie moved to the Oklahoma Territory and aided in that state entering the Union with a dry constitution. She traveled across Europe from 1908 to 1909 and tried her hand in the entertainment industry. She had stints in several music halls in Great Britain, but she was more interested in sermonizing than entertaining. Audience members, on the other hand, didn't find her proselytizing all that entertaining, and during a 1909 music hall lecture at the Canterbury Theatre of Varieties in Westminster, London, someone threw a literal egg at Carrie. She dramatically ripped up her contract with the theater and headed back to the United States, where she worked to make a living lecturing, selling signed photographs of herself, and selling more of those collectible hatchet pins. At the age of 60, Carrie moved to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and into a modest, unassuming white clapboard house at number 35 Steel Street. She called it Hatchet Hall, and though it was her home, she also used it as a boarding house for girls in college, widows, and battered women. Room and board was a quarter of what other boarding houses charged at $10 a month, or about $300 a month in modern money. She also turned the home into a K-12 school in 1910, where the students took classes and did regular household chores. Carrie had been in poor health for some time. She collapsed while visiting relatives during the holidays in 1910. She was also in a fight with her son-in-law over the care of her daughter, Charlene, who was suffering herself from mental illness. Her son-in-law had Charlene committed to an asylum in San Antonio against Carrie's wishes. All of this was just too much for her ailing body. She collapsed into the bed of her wagon during a speech at a Eureka Springs park after proclaiming, quote, "I have done what I could," end quote. Carrie was taken to a hospital in Leavenworth, Kansas. She refused to eat and remained bedridden until her death at the hospital on June 9, 1911, at 65 years old. She is now buried in the southeastern side of Belton Cemetery in Belton, Missouri. The Women's Christian Temperance Union later erected a stone inscribed Carrie A. Nation, spelled with a Y, and "Faithful to the cause of prohibition, she hath done what she could." So what do you think? Was Carrie a wild, hatchet-wielding lunatic with a literal axe to grind over something so silly as alcohol? Or did her beliefs have a real, important motive? Do you agree with her methods? What about her reasoning? How might mental illness, potentially traveling through the generations through genetics, play an impact on the way that Carrie behaved? Was alcohol the real enemy here, or were there some other things at play? Is there something that you would lift a hatchet for, so to speak? What are the beliefs that you are willing to go to the ends of the earth and jail for? Is there anything? Alcohol was prohibited in the United States through the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in January of 1919 and was ended by the 21st Amendment in 1933. Women gained the right to vote in the United States on August 18, 1920. Carrie's legacy is mixed. Some believe that not only were her methods needlessly violent, but they actually promoted beer and liquor sales. Men all over the country discussed Cyclone Carrie at the bar. And bar owners of bars smashed by Carrie would often sell shards of mirrors she had shattered for a few cents with a free glass of beer. But her unorthodox ways managed to focus attention on the issue of temperance in a way that others had been unable to do. The Carrie Nation House in Medicine Lodge, Kansas was declared a U.S. National Historic Landmark in 1976. A spring just across the street from Hatchet Hall in Eureka Springs is named after her. Her daughter, Charlene Gloyd McNabb, died in the same sanitarium in San Antonio that her husband had committed her to. She was 60 years old. She's buried next to her husband, Alexander McNabb, who had died 18 years prior. They had 4 children together. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed our Deconstructed Margarita and hearing about a lady who wasn't afraid to do a little deconstructing of her own. Next week, we head to the Big Apple for my first foray into a chocolate margarita. Well, yeah, a chocolate margarita. And as usual, I'm worried. I have stuck to my guns thus far about margaritas needing to have 2 things, tequila and lime juice. And lime juice can really ruin a drink if you're not careful. I'm going to keep an open mind, that's for sure. The crime for next week does not disappoint. Jealousy, love triangle, sort of. Theater at Madison Square Garden, a pistol hidden beneath a heavy jacket, and yet another crime that led to what the yellow press deemed the trial of the century. How cliche. Did they realize they can't have unlimited numbers of those? Seems like they did not. Quick reminder that I'm giving away a bunch of great books next month, and you just need to be following me on one of my social media sites to be entered. So hop on Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook and follow. Next month, I have some special things planned, and I'm going to need your help. We're doing a top 10 countdown for both margaritas and mayhem, so be thinking about the drinks and cases that you like the most this year. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to murder and smashing things you don't like.